Hello everyone, my name is Renato Costa, this is Aussie Law, and today we're going to make our first video specifically about one Australian case. Today we will look at one of the first ever cases decided by the High Court of Australia. It was a case from 1904. I'm talking about Tasmania and the Commonwealth. There are many reasons for you to read this case, but the reason why I want you to watch this video is because this case was paradigmatic in establishing the way in which the High Court of Australia was to interpret the Australian Constitution. The different opinions of the different justices are full of tips of statutory interpretation in Australia. So, if you want to understand more about constitutional interpretation and you want to learn more about the first principles of statutory interpretation, this is the place to be and this is the video you should be watching. By the way, if you don't want to miss any of our videos, make sure that you're subscribed and that you hit the bell sign. So, let's get into it. Let's talk about Tasmania and the Commonwealth of 1904. As you probably noticed, this case was decided 1 year after the creation of the High Court of Australia. So the sitting justices were Samuel Griffith as the Chief Justice and Barton and O'Connor as the other two sitting justices. And the facts of the case relate to customs and excise duties during the transition from the colonial period to the Federation. Custom duties are kinds of tax that are imposed on goods when they are being transported across borders. And excise duties are kinds of tax that are imposed on goods for their production, licensing or sale. So there were some rules about that in Chapter 4 of the Australian Constitution. In a nutshell, in the first moment, during this transition to the Federation, the Commonwealth was to impose uniform duties and collect that tax. And in a second moment, it would then pay the revenue to the states. What happened, and these are the facts of the case, was that the Commonwealth collected the duties from the goods that were manufactured in Victoria, but then were transported to Tasmania. That was the first part. But then, when it was the time to pay the revenue from the tax, then the Commonwealth paid it to Victoria, and Tasmania claimed that they were the ones who were supposed to receive it. Since this was a process that was established by the Constitution, and specifically here for this case, the issue was with Section 89, then it soon became a problem of how to interpret the Australian Constitution. And as you already know, because you've watched the video that's appearing on the card above, this is a matter for the High Court of Australia. And to solve that case, the justices of the High Court had to establish which was the appropriate approach to interpret the Australian Constitution. This is obviously a very important decision for us. In that decision, the High Court said that the Constitution of Australia should be interpreted according to the ordinary methods and principles of the statutory interpretation. So let's see what each one of the High Court justices said about this. Let's start with Chief Justice Griffith. In basic terms, Chief Justice Griffith said that the Constitution was to be interpreted as an act of Parliament. So basically, all the same rules that apply to in the interpretation of any other written document would be applied to the interpretation of the Constitution as well. But what are these principles and methods? He said that if the provision of the Constitution was expressly stated and it was clear enough, there was no need to go outside of the Constitution and try to understand it in a broader context. The Constitution should not be read with a higher rule of construction in sight. He said, "It is always a question of construction whether we are called upon to construe the terms of a section or to decide whether powers are necessarily to be implied in addition to those which are expressed." This is particularly important in that context for that case, because the plaintiff, Tasmania, they wanted to receive the money, and they said that they would have received the money if the intentions of the framers of the 1891 Convention had come to be. But what Griffith was saying was that there was no need to go back to that convention, because the framers of the Constitution, they decided for a certain scheme, and that scheme was expressed in the Constitution, and that was the scheme that ought to be followed. In his words, he said, one scheme was finally adopted, and what that is to be ascertained from the language of the Constitution, and all we have to do is to interpret that language. Basically, if the Constitution said something expressly, then there was no need to go outside of the Constitution and try to identify its meaning. A literal approach should be sufficient to interpret the Australian Constitution. Justice Barton also agreed with Chief Justice Griffith. Do you remember Edmund Barton? Check the link that is appearing above. For Justice Barton, the whole case depended on the interpretation of a word in Section 93 that was the word imported. And in his perspective, following this literal approach, if the word is there, that was because the framers of the Constitution decided to put that word there, and it should be interpreted according to its meaning. In case there is a missing word or there's a difficulty interpreting the meaning of the word, then we should go outside and try to identify its meaning. But Justice Barton said that this was not the case here. He could not see any ambiguity coming out of the text of the Constitution, and particularly from the word imported. So that's why there was no reason to go outside of the text of the Constitution to identify the meaning of the provision. He basically said that it would be an absurd if we had to go outside of the Constitution to identify the meaning of a text that was expressly stated in the Constitution. Although Barton admitted that the intention of the Constitution is rather to outline principles than to engrave details, he also said that we have to declare what seems to us to be the proper meaning of the language, and we are to arrive at that meaning by reference to the words themselves and to the history of the law. Finally, Justice O'Connor also agreed with his fellow justices. O'Connor said, "I do not think it can be too strongly stated that our duty in interpreting a statute is to declare and administer the law according to the intention expressed in the statute itself. In this respect, the Constitution differs in no way from any statute of the Commonwealth or of a state." And he continued, "It appears to me the only safe rule is to look at the statute itself and to gather from it what is its intention. If we depart from that rule, we are apt to run the risk of the danger of abandoning the office of judge and assuming the province of legislation." So the High Court clearly assumed a literal approach to interpreting the Constitution. But the justices also said, and this was very clear, that this was not the only way to interpret the Constitution. If textualism failed, then we should search for the meaning of the words in another way. Look at another part of Justice O'Connor's opinion. The intention of the enactment is to be gathered from its words. If the words are plain, effect must be given to them. If they are doubtful, the intention of the legislature is to be gathered from the other provisions of the statute, added by a consideration of surrounding circumstances. Did you notice what he said? If the words fail, we should look at the structure, at some other aspects of the Constitution. And if that failed, we should look at the surrounding circumstances, the history of the law, the history of the Constitution. So some extrinsic aspects can also help us interpret the Constitution, depending on what the text of the Constitution says. If you don't know what we're talking about with all of these methods, make sure to watch the video by clicking on the top right corner, the one that I talk about the methods of constitutional interpretation in Australia. So, what was the result of Tasmania and Commonwealth of 1904? The High Court unanimously decided that Victoria should not have to pay Tasmania for the excise and customs duties that were paid by the Commonwealth. And more importantly for us, It established that we have to follow the principles of statutory interpretation in order to understand and correctly interpret the Australian Constitution. So, did you like the explanation of this case? Did it help you understand a bit more about constitutional interpretation in Australia? Let me know in the comments, and don't leave this video without leaving a like and also subscribing to our channel. I hope to see you next time. Until then, ciao!